The briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Command fell silent when she walked in. Commander Alexis Reaper Vance moved through the space with the kind of economy that came from 15 years of close-quarters combat, her boots barely making sound against the polished floor. The men seated around the tactical display didn't stand. They didn't salute. They just stared, and in that staring was everything she'd fought against since boot camp. The youngest SEAL, a sandy-haired operator with biceps that stretched his fatigues, leaned toward his teammate. His whisper carried across the room like he wanted it to. "They're really scraping the bottom of the barrel now." Reaper's face didn't change. She'd learned long ago that reaction was permission, that showing them it landed was the same as bleeding in shark-infested waters. She set her mission folder on the table and remained standing, her posture relaxed but centered, weight distributed like she could move in any direction without telegraphing intent. The team leader, Captain Marcus Holt, was a brick wall of a man with a reputation for impossible extractions and zero tolerance for what he called political theater. He looked at her personnel file on his tablet, then at her, then back at the file like he was searching for the punchline. "Commander Vance," he said, her rank sounding like an accusation. "Naval aviator, A-10 pilot, 16 confirmed close air support missions in Kandahar, Silver Star for that business in Helmand Province." He paused, letting the room absorb the implication that none of it mattered here. "And now they've got you running with SEALs. You understand this isn't a cockpit, right? This is ground work, wet work, the kind that gets your hands dirty." She met his eyes without blinking. "I understand the mission, sir. Hostage extraction, 12 miles inside Syrian territory. 3 high-value targets being held in a compound that's been under surveillance for 6 weeks. The terrain is compromised, air superiority is contested, and the extraction window is 4 minutes from boots on ground to wheels up. I'm here because my AC-130 gunship experience and my tactical coordination record make me the most qualified combat controller you're going to get on 72 hours' notice." Holt's jaw worked like he was chewing gravel. The room temperature seemed to drop. Another operator, this one with a thick Louisiana accent and a scar that ran from his temple to his collar, let out a low whistle. "Combat controller," he drawled. "That what they're calling pilots now who can't hack it in the air." Reaper's hand moved to her hip, but not for a weapon. She pulled out a tactical radio, set it on the table between them, and keyed the frequency to the operation channel. "I'm here because 3 Americans are going to die if we don't move in 36 hours, she said quietly. "You can question my credentials after we bring them home." Captain Holt stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a blade being drawn. He was 6'4", 230, and had the kind of physical presence that made rooms feel smaller. He walked around the table toward Reaper with deliberate steps, and the operators around the table tensed with anticipation. This was theater, she realized. A test wrapped in humiliation, wrapped in the kind of institutional hazing that had ended careers and broken spirits. When he got within arm's reach, Holt stopped. His voice dropped to just above a whisper, but in the silent room it carried to every corner. "You think you can run with my team? You think you've got what it takes to operate in the dark with men who have spent their entire adult lives perfecting violence?" Reaper didn't step back, didn't brace, didn't give him the satisfaction of a flinch. "I think I've spent 15 years putting ordnance on target while enemy fire turned the sky into a knife fight," she said. "I think I've talked men through sieges while watching my fuel gauge drop into the red. I think I've made split-second calls that meant the difference between a team going home or going into body bags. And I think if you're done measuring, sir, we have 3 hostages who are running out of time." The Louisiana operator laughed, but it was a harsh sound without humor. "She's got teeth." "I'll give her that." Holt's eyes narrowed. Then, without warning, his hand shot out toward her face, an open-palm strike that would have connected with her jaw if she'd been standing there. But Reaper wasn't standing there. She'd read the micro-expressions, the slight drop of his shoulder, the telegraphed weight shift that came before the strike. Her body moved with muscle memory older than thought. She slipped inside his reach, redirected his momentum with her forearm, and in the same fluid motion swept his lead leg while using his own force against him. Holt hit the floor hard enough to drive the air from his lungs. Before anyone else in the room could move, Reaper had his arm in a joint lock that would break his elbow if she applied 3 more pounds of pressure. The room exploded into motion. Operators were on their feet, weapons not drawn but hands moving toward holsters. The sandy-haired SEAL who'd made the first comment looked like he'd just watched physics reverse itself. Reaper held the lock for exactly 2 seconds, then released and stepped back, her hands open and non-threatening. Captain Holt stayed on the floor for a moment, his chest heaving. Then he laughed. It started low in his chest and built until it filled the room, genuine and surprised in something that might have been respect. He rolled to his feet with the easy athleticism of a man who'd been knocked down before and would be again. "Krav Maga?" he asked, rotating his shoulder experimentally. "Israeli Defense Force taught me when I was cross-training at Nevatim Air Base," Reaper said. "They have a saying, walk in peace but prepare for war. I've been preparing since I was 17, sir, just like you." Holt looked at her for a long moment and something shifted in his expression. The test was over. Whatever he'd been looking for, he'd found it. Or maybe he'd found something he hadn't expected. He gestured to the table. "Sit down, Commander. Let's talk about getting our people home." The operators settled back into their seats, but the atmosphere had changed. The Louisiana SEAL with the scar was looking at her differently now, not with respect yet, but with the kind of curiosity that preceded it. The sandy-haired kid was staring at his hands like they'd betrayed him. Reaper pulled out a chair and sat, her movements controlled and precise. Holt opened his mission folder and spread satellite imagery across the table. The compound in question was a cluster of stone buildings arranged in a rough square, surrounded by 8-foot walls topped with wire and monitored by 4 visible camera positions. "The hostages are here," Holt said, tapping a building on the eastern side. 3 American contractors who were surveying pipeline routes when they got snatched. 2 men, 1 woman. Intel says they're being held separately, which makes extraction complicated. The holding force is approximately 25 combatants, well-armed and paranoid. They move the hostages every 6 hours, which means we have exactly 1 window to hit them when we know where all 3 are located. Reaper leaned forward, studying the imagery. Her eyes traced sight lines, calculated angles of approach, identified choke points and kill zones. When she spoke, her voice had shifted into something clinical and precise. "Air support is going to be limited. Syrian air defense has been upgraded in this sector. They've got S-400 systems that can reach out and touch anything we put in the sky. Fast movers can't loiter, and helicopters are vulnerable on approach. What's the plan for close air support?" Holt's expression darkened. "That's the problem, we don't have one. Air Force says the risk is too high for A-10s and AC-130s can't operate in contested airspace without fighter escort. We were planning to go in dark, fast, and hope we could get out before the response got organized." The room went quiet. Every operator around that table knew what "go in dark" meant in practical terms. It meant no overhead protection, no angel watching from above with Hellfire missiles and a 30 cannon. It meant if things went sideways, they'd be alone in hostile territory with 25 armed combatants between them and the extraction point. Reaper pulled out her own tablet and started sketching on the tactical display. What if you didn't go in dark? What if you had a gunship that could stay low enough to avoid the S-400 engagement envelope, fast enough to maneuver if they got locked up, and heavily armed enough to suppress any QRF that showed up? The Louisiana operator leaned forward. "No disrespect, ma'am, but there's no such aircraft. AC-130s are slow and vulnerable. A-10s can't provide sustained fire support and can't carry enough ordnance for a sustained engagement. You'd need something that doesn't exist." Reaper's smile was thin and dangerous. "You'd need an A-10 Thunderbolt II that's been modified for extended loiter time, equipped with advanced targeting pods, and flown by someone who knows Syrian air defense patterns well enough to thread the needle. Someone who's done low-level penetration missions in worse conditions and come home. Someone who's been waiting for a mission exactly like this for the last 8 months since she rotated back stateside." Holt's eyes locked onto hers. You're saying you can provide close air support in an S-400 environment. I'm saying I've flown through worse, Reaper said. Helmand Province, 2019. Taliban had gotten their hands on Chinese HQ-9 systems, which are basically S-300 knockoffs. I spent 40 minutes in contested airspace providing danger-close fire support for a Marine platoon that was surrounded. I took 3 proximity detonations that damaged my hydraulics, flew home on backup systems, and put the bird down with 600 pounds of fuel remaining. The Marines walked out, all of them. The room had gone very still. Holt looked at the other operators, reading something in their faces that Reaper couldn't see. The sandy-haired SEAL spoke up for the first time since Reaper had put Holt on the floor. His voice was younger than his body suggested, uncertain in a way that spoke to inexperience. "Commander, that mission you're talking about in Helmand, that was you? We studied that in advanced tactics. They told us the pilot was. Well, they never gave us the name, just said it was classified. They said whoever flew that mission had the kind of spatial awareness and threat assessment capability that comes along once in a generation." Reaper didn't react to the compliment. She'd learned early that accepting praise from men who didn't respect you was a trap. Instead, she pulled up a tactical overlay on her tablet and began marking vectors. The compound has clear approaches from the west and north, but both are covered by observation posts. If you go in from the east, you're channelized through these alleys, which makes you vulnerable to ambush. The south approach is the only one that gives you flexibility, but it's also the longest ingress and puts you in the open for approximately 40 seconds before you reach the wall. Holt studied her markings, his jaw working again in that unconscious gesture that meant he was processing. South approach puts us 300 meters from the target building in open ground. That's a kill zone if they have any kind of security posture. We'd need suppression fire the entire time, which brings us back to the air support problem. "Not if I'm overhead before you hit the ground," Reaper said. She pulled up a flight profile on the display. "I come in low, following this wadi system that runs parallel to the compound. The terrain masks me from the S-400 radar until I'm within 5 clicks of the target. At that range, I can pop up, acquire, and engage any threats on your approach vector before their air defense systems can get a clean lock. Once you're inside the compound, I orbit at low altitude and provide on-call fires for anything that moves against you. When you're ready for extract, I clear the exit route and provide cover all the way to the pickup point." The Louisiana operator, whose name tape read DVRX, shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, you're talking about flying a gunship in urban terrain at night, in a hot zone with enemy air defense systems looking for exactly what you'd be doing. That's not brave. That's suicidal." Reaper finally let herself smile, and it wasn't a warm expression. "Sergeant Devereaux, I've been dying slowly in debriefs and readiness reviews for 8 months. I'll take a combat mission over death by PowerPoint any day of the week." That got a laugh. It rippled around the table, breaking some of the tension that had been building since Reaper walked in. Even Holt cracked something that might have been a smile, though it looked like the expression hurt his face. "All right, Commander," Holt said. "You've got my attention. Walk me through this profile from takeoff to touchdown. I want to know every threat, every contingency, and every way this goes wrong. If you can convince me you can keep my team alive, I'll authorize the air support package. But understand something. I'm putting my men's lives in your hands. If you screw this up, if you can't deliver what you're promising, good people die. That's not a metaphor, that's the actual consequence." Reaper met his eyes without flinching. "Sir, I've been carrying that weight since my first combat mission. It doesn't get lighter, but you learn to carry it better. I won't let your team down because I can't afford to. Not professionally, not personally, not morally. Those hostages and your SEALs are going to come home. I'll make sure of it." Holt held her gaze for a 5 count, then nodded. "Brief the mission. You've got 30 minutes to convince me." Reaper stood and walked to the tactical display, pulling up 3-dimensional terrain mapping of the target area. As she began walking through her flight profile, marking ingress routes and engagement zones, she felt the room's energy shift again. The operators were leaning forward now, asking tactical questions instead of challenging her presence. Devereaux wanted to know her weapon's loadout. The sandy-haired SEAL, whose name tape read MITCHELL, asked about her radio frequencies and authentication protocols. Another operator, an older man with sergeant's stripes and a face like weathered leather, inquired about her fuel calculations and emergency divert options. She answered every question with precision and detail, demonstrating not just knowledge, but the kind of operational experience that couldn't be faked. She talked about the sound of hydraulic failure at 12,000 feet, the way tracer fire looked coming up through cloud cover, the mathematical certainty of fuel consumption versus engagement time versus distance to friendly airspace. She spoke the language of combat aviation with the fluency of someone who'd written sentences in fire and blood across hostile skis. When she finished, the room was silent again. But this was a different silence than the one that had greeted her arrival. This was the silence of professional respect, of operators recognizing another operator, regardless of gender or service branch or the politics that had put her in this room. Captain Holt stood and extended his hand. The gesture was formal, old-fashioned, and carried weight beyond the simple act. "Welcome to the team, Commander Vance. We step off in 32 hours. I want you integrated into our comms net, briefed on our tactical protocols, and ready to fly. Mitchell, get her set up with our encryption keys. Devereaux, coordinate with her on fire support procedures. Santos," he nodded to the weathered sergeant, "work out the extraction timing with her. If we're going to do this, we do it right." Reaper shook his hand, her grip firm without trying to prove anything. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." As the operators began gathering around her, pulling out tactical maps and starting the detailed coordination that would mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe, Mitchell appeared at her elbow. Up close, he was younger than she'd initially thought, maybe 24, with the kind of earnest face that hadn't yet learned to hide what he was thinking. "Commander," he said quietly, "I'm sorry about earlier. The comment I made when you walked in, that was out of line." Reaper studied him for a moment. She could see the sincerity in his expression, the genuine discomfort of a young man who'd been raised better than his mouth had suggested. "You know what the difference is between a good operator and a great one, Mitchell. Good operators learn from their mistakes. Great operators learn from other people's mistakes. You just learned something today about making assumptions. Don't forget it." He nodded, something like relief crossing his face. "Yes, ma'am. I won't." The next 32 hours passed in a blur of preparation that Reaper knew intimately. The military, for all its chaos and unpredictability in combat, ran on detailed planning during the approach phase. She spent 6 hours with Santos working out fuel calculations, weapons loadouts, and emergency procedures. She memorized the team's call signs, their tactical hand signals, their individual weapons platforms and preferred engagement ranges. She coordinated with Devereaux on fire support protocols, running through scenario after scenario of what would happen if the mission went sideways. They wargamed equipment failures, hostile air defense activations, hostage injuries, and compromised extraction points. By the time they finished, Reaper had filled 3 tactical notebooks with information and had integrated herself into the team's operational rhythm. She ate meals in the SEAL team room, which was decorated with unit flags, weapon racks, and photos of operators from missions going back decades. She slept in the on-base quarters for 4 hours, her mind running through mission profiles even in sleep. When she woke, it was to the sound of helicopters spinning up outside. The extraction birds were MH-60 Blackhawks, modified for special operations with enhanced defensive systems and forward-looking infrared. She walked through the pre-dawn darkness to the flight line where her A-10 waited. The aircraft sat under portable lights like a predator at rest, its titanium bathtub fuselage scarred from previous missions, its GAU-8 Avenger cannon jutting from the nose like a promise of violence. Crew Chief, a master sergeant named Kowalski who'd worked on A-10 since before Reaper learned to fly, was running final checks. "She's ready, ma'am," Kowalski said, not looking up from his checklist. Full load on the Avenger AGM-65 Mavericks on Stations 3 and 9, AIM-9 Sidewinders for self-defense. Fuel tanks are topped off, all systems green. She's a little heavy with the combat load, so rotation speed is going to be higher than normal. Be gentle with her on takeoff. Reaper smiled. Kowalski had been telling her to be gentle with aircraft for 5 years, and she'd never pranged one yet. I'll treat her like my firstborn child, Sergeant. That's what I'm afraid of, Kowalski muttered, but there was affection in his voice. Go get 'em, Reaper, and come back in one piece, both of you. She climbed into the cockpit, the seat conforming to her body with the familiar comfort of 1,000 previous flights. The instrument panel glowed with subdued red lighting, each gauge and switch exactly where her hands expected to find them. She began the startup sequence, her fingers moving through the checklist with automatic precision while her mind was already ahead, visualizing the flight profile and engagement sequences. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, building to the deep rumble that made the A-10 sound like rolling thunder. Reaper ran through her weapons checks, verifying that each system was hot and ready. The GAU-8 cannon showed green, its 7 barrels ready to spin up and deliver depleted uranium rounds at 4,200 rounds per minute. The Mavericks were locked and loaded, their seeker heads calibrated and responsive. The radio crackled in her helmet. Reaper, this is Demon One. It was Holt's voice calling from the lead Blackhawk. We're at mission ready. Radio check. Demon One, Reaper reads you 5x5, she responded, her voice calm and professional. I'm green across the board, standing by for departure clearance. The tower granted clearance, and Reaper advanced the throttles, feeling the A-10 strain against the brakes like a leashed animal. When she released them, the aircraft surged forward, gathering speed down the runway. At 130 knots, she pulled back on the stick, and the Warthog lifted into the night sky, its heavy weapons load making the climb more labored than usual but still well within performance parameters. She banked east, falling into formation with the Blackhawks as they headed toward Syrian airspace. The flight across the Mediterranean was conducted in radio silence, each aircraft running with minimal lighting, navigating by GPS and terrain-following radar. Below, the black water stretched to the horizon, and above, stars wheeled in patterns that hadn't changed since humans first looked up and wondered what lay beyond. Reaper ran through her mental checklist again, visualizing the engagement. First pass would be reconnaissance, using her targeting pod to confirm hostage locations and identify any air defense systems the intelligence briefing had missed. Second pass would be the team insertion, with Reaper providing suppressive fire on any defensive positions that activated. Once the SEALs were inside the compound, she'd orbit at low altitude, maintaining visual contact and ready to engage anything that threatened the mission. The Syrian coast appeared as a dark line against the horizon. Reaper broke formation with the Blackhawks, descending to 500 feet and following the Wadi system she'd mapped during her mission planning. The terrain rose around her, rock walls flowing past her wingtips in the darkness. Her radar warning receiver was silent, which meant the S-400 systems hadn't detected her yet. That wouldn't last. The moment she popped up over the ridge line to acquire the compound, every air defense system in the sector would light her up. It was a calculated risk, but all combat aviation was calculated risk. You measured the odds, made your decision, and lived with the consequences. The compound appeared on her forward-looking infrared, a cluster of white-hot buildings against the cooler desert floor. Reaper climbed sharply, breaking over the ridge line at 4,000 feet and immediately activating her targeting pod. The compound came into sharp focus, every detail visible in thermal imaging. She could see guards on the walls, heat signatures inside the buildings, and what looked like a technical vehicle with a mounted machine gun parked near the main gate. Her radar warning receiver erupted with audio warnings. Multiple search radars had locked onto her position, and somewhere in the darkness, an S-400 battery was calculating firing solutions. Reaper broke hard right, dumping chaff and flares while descending back below the ridge line. The locked tone died, but she knew they'd seen her. The element of surprise was gone. Demon 1, Reaper, she called over the radio. Target is hot. Multiple guards visible, approximately 20 tangos spread across the compound. Hostages appear to be in the eastern building, second floor. You've got one technical at the main gate and what looks like a mortar pit in the northwest corner. Air defense has my position. We need to move now before they get organized. Copy, Reaper, Holt responded. We're 3 minutes out from insertion point. Can you suppress that technical? Stand by. Reaper climbed again, this time staying below the ridge line but gaining enough altitude to bring her weapons to bear. She designated the technical vehicle with her targeting pod, waiting for the Maverick missile to achieve lock. The tone sounded in her helmet, and she squeezed the trigger. The missile dropped from the wing pylon, its rocket motor igniting a half-second later. She watched through the targeting pod as it streaked across 2 miles of darkness and impacted the technical in a flash of white thermal bloom. The vehicle disintegrated and the guards who'd been standing near it scattered. Technical destroyed, she reported. Gates are clear. Demon 1, you are clear for approach. The Blackhawks came in low and fast, their rotor wash kicking up dust clouds that obscured the landing zone. She watched through her targeting pod as the SEALs fast-roped down, moving with the practiced efficiency of operators who'd done this hundreds of times. They hit the ground running, weapons up, spreading into tactical formation as they moved toward the compound walls. Reaper orbited overhead, her finger on the trigger guard of the GAU-8, ready to rain hell on anything that threatened Holt's team. The SEALs breached the wall with explosive charges, the thermal bloom whiting out her display for a moment. When it cleared, they were inside, moving through the compound in a choreographed pattern that looked like violence ballet. She could hear the radio chatter now, the clipped professional communication of men in combat. Demon 2, you've got 3 tangos in the courtyard north side. Engaging. The sound of suppressed weapons fire came through her headset. Tangos down. Reaper saw movement on her thermal display, guards responding to the breach, moving toward the SEAL's position with weapons raised. She keyed her mic. Demon 1, you've got 5 tangos approaching from the west side building, approximately 30 seconds from your position. Copy, Reaper. Can you engage? She was already rolling in, descending toward the compound while lining up the GAU-8. The targeting pipper settled on the western building, and she held it there, compensating for wind and aircraft movement with tiny stick inputs. At 800 meters, she squeezed the trigger. The Avenger cannon roared to life, the entire aircraft shuddering from the recoil of the massive weapon. Depleted uranium rounds tore through the western building at 4,200 rounds per minute, each round capable of penetrating armor plating. The building's thermal signature erupted with secondary explosions as the rounds found ammunition stores inside. The 5 tangos who'd been moving to flank the SEALs simply ceased to exist. Western approach is clear, Reaper reported, pulling up and breaking left to avoid ground fire. Tracers were coming up now, green streaks in the darkness that looked lazy, until you realized they were moving at 2,800 feet per second. She jinked right, then left, making herself a difficult target while maintaining visual contact with the compound. Demon 1 is at the hostage building, Holt's voice came through, breathing hard from exertion. Breaching now. Reaper's radar warning receiver screamed again. The S-400 battery had achieved a solid lock, and her threat display showed a missile launch. She had maybe 12 seconds before impact. She dumped chaff and flares while diving toward the ground, using the terrain to break the radar lock. The missile overflew her position by 300 feet and detonated, the proximity fuse triggering a blast that rocked her aircraft but caused no damage. Her hand stayed steady on the controls, her voice calm on the radio. Demon 1, I've got SAMs in the air. I can stay on station for approximately 4 more minutes before I need to clear the engagement zone. What's your status? We've got the hostages, Holt responded. 2 are ambulatory, 1 is injured. We need 3 minutes to get back to the extraction point. Can you give us 3 minutes? Reaper looked at her fuel gauge, at her threat display showing multiple radar systems trying to lock her up, at the tracer fire still reaching toward her from the compound below. 3 minutes might as well be 3 hours in this environment. Every second she stayed increased the probability of a catastrophic hit. But below her, 12 Americans were running through hostile territory with 3 rescued hostages, and without her overhead, they'd be facing every enemy combatant in the region. "I can give you 3 minutes," she said, and meant it. She broke hard right as another SAM launched, this one coming from a mobile system that had repositioned during the engagement. The missile was faster than the first, its motor burning bright in her night vision. She pulled 6 GS, the aircraft groaning under the strain, and released chaff in a continuous stream. The missile lost lock at the last second and detonated 200 feet behind her, the blast wave hitting her aircraft like a hammer. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, right engine temperature climbing, flight control system degraded to backup mode. The A-10 was wounded, but it was still flying, still fighting. She rolled inverted and dove toward the compound again, acquiring the mortar pit that had been flagged in her initial reconnaissance. The GAU-8 spoke again, and the mortar position vanished in a cloud of dust and thermal signatures going cold. "Demon 1, you've got a clear run to extraction," she called. "All defensive positions neutralized. The sky belongs to you. Copy, Reaper. We're moving now, 30 seconds to the LZ." She could see them on her thermal display, running through the darkness with 3 smaller signatures between them, the hostages being carried and supported by the SEALs. The Blackhawks came in again, their pilots showing the kind of courage that made Reaper proud to wear the same uniform. They hovered in the dust and chaos while the SEALs loaded the hostages, then the team, then lifted off in a storm of rotor wash and suppressive fire. "Demon 1 is clear," Holt's voice came through, relief evident even through his professional tone. "All personnel accounted for. Reaper, get yourself home. That's an order." She smiled inside her helmet, already turning west toward friendly airspace. "Copy, Demon 1. It's been a pleasure working with you gentlemen. Reaper is clear and heading home." The flight back was a study in controlled emergency procedures. Reaper nursed the wounded A-10 across Syria, then across the Mediterranean, watching her instruments carefully for any indication that the damage was worse than it appeared. The right engine was running hot but stable. Hydraulic pressure had stabilized at 60%, enough to maintain control. The flight control computer was squawking degraded mode, but the aircraft was responding to her inputs. She could work with this. She'd worked with worse. The sun was rising behind her as she crossed into friendly airspace, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded her why she flew. Up here, above the politics and the prejudice and the institutional resistance, there was just her and the aircraft and the mission. Up here, competence mattered more than gender, performance mattered more than perception, and the only question that counted was whether you could deliver when everything depended on it. She delivered. The SEALs were safe. The hostages were free. The mission was a success. And somewhere in a briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Command, Captain Marcus Holt was probably having a very interesting conversation about the pilot who just saved his team. Reaper keyed her radio, calling for landing clearance at the forward operating base. The tower responded immediately, already alerted to her damaged status. They'd have fire trucks and emergency crews standing by. She set up for approach, configuring the aircraft for landing while monitoring her degraded systems. The runway appeared ahead, a strip of concrete that looked impossibly narrow from her current altitude. She began her descent, maintaining precise speed and altitude control despite the compromised flight systems. At 200 feet, the right engine seized. The temperature gauge spiked into the red zone, and the engine turbine disintegrated with a bang that Reaper felt through the entire airframe. Suddenly, she was flying a single-engine approach in a heavily damaged aircraft with minimal hydraulics and degraded flight controls. The ground was rushing up, the runway threshold passing beneath her nose. She pulled power on the left engine while fighting to keep the wings level with the stick. The A-10 wanted to roll right, pulled by the dead engine's drag, but she held it with brute force and sheer will. The main gear touched down harder than she would have liked, the impact jarring through the seat. She immediately deployed the drag chute, feeling it catch and slow the aircraft. The Wounded decelerated down the runway, its nose finally dropping as airspeed fell below 60 knots. She steered with differential braking and what remained of her hydraulic system, guiding the aircraft to a stop 3/4 of the way down the runway. When the engines finally spooled down to silence, Reaper sat in the cockpit for a moment, her hands still on the controls, her breathing returning to normal. Through her canopy, she could see fire trucks approaching, their lights flashing in the early morning sun. She popped the canopy and climbed down, her legs slightly unsteady from adrenaline come-down and the physical stress of high-G maneuvering. Kowalski was there, running toward the aircraft with his maintenance crew. His face was a mixture of relief and horror as he took in the damage. "Sweet Jesus, ma'am," he breathed, staring at the destroyed engine and the shrapnel damage along the right side of the fuselage. "How did you even get this thing home?" Reaper pulled off her helmet, her hair matted with sweat, and managed a tired smile. "Same way I always do, Sergeant, carefully." 3 days later, she was called back to Naval Special Warfare Command. She walked into the same briefing room where she'd first met Captain Holt, expecting a routine debrief. Instead, she found the entire SEAL team waiting for her. They stood when she entered. This time, they stood together. Holt approached her with something in his hand, a patch, worn and faded, with the SEAL trident and a Latin phrase she didn't recognize. "Commander Vance," he said formally, "on behalf of this team, I want to present you with this. It belonged to my first team leader, a man who taught me that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing the job anyway. He wore this patch through 3 deployments and more firefights than I can count. When he retired, he gave it to me. Now I'm giving it to you because you've earned it. You're not just a pilot who supported this team. You're an operator who kept us alive when we had no right to expect it. You're one of us." Reaper took the patch, feeling the weight of history and respect sewn into its fabric. "Sir, I don't know what to say." Holt smiled, and this time it was genuine. "You don't have to say anything. Your flying said everything that needed saying. You're welcome on this team anytime, anywhere. All you have to do is ask." Mitchell stepped forward next, the young SEAL who'd made the thoughtless comment 3 days and a lifetime ago. "Ma'am, I learned something on that mission. I learned that the person I thought was the most dangerous operator in that compound wasn't carrying a rifle. She was flying overhead, keeping us alive while taking fire from every direction. Thank you for that lesson. I won't forget it." Devereaux was next, his Louisiana drawl thick with emotion. "Reaper, you're stone-cold crazy, and I mean that as the highest compliment I can give. You flew through hell and brought us all home. If you ever need anything, anything at all, you call me. I don't care if it's the middle of the night. I don't care if I'm on the other side of the world. You call, I come running." "That's a promise." Santos, the weathered sergeant, simply nodded and extended his hand. When she took it, his grip was firm and warm. "You're good people, ma'am, real good people, the kind we need more of in this business." The next few hours passed in a blur of debriefs and after-action reports. Reaper walked the team through her engagement sequence, explaining her tactical decisions and what she'd learned about Syrian air defense capabilities. They listened with the focused attention of professionals who understood that every mission contained lessons that might save lives in the future. When it was finally over, when the last report was filed and the last question answered, Holt walked her to the door. "Commander, can I ask you something personal?" Reaper nodded, curious. "Why do they call you Reaper?" She smiled, but it was a complicated expression. "My first combat mission. I was providing close air support for a Marine patrol that got ambushed. They were surrounded, taking fire from 3 directions, and their air controller was wounded. I stayed on station for 90 minutes, making gun runs until my barrel temperature was in the red and my ammunition counter was reading single digits. When it was over, the Marine captain called me on the radio. He said, 'I don't know who you are, but you're the angel of death for our enemies. You're the Reaper.'" The name stuck. Holt studied her face for a moment. "You saved those Marines, just like you saved my team. That's not the angel of death. That's the angel of life. Don't forget that." She walked out into the sunlight, feeling the weight of the SEAL team patch in her pocket and the weight of the mission lifted from her shoulders. The Mediterranean sky stretched overhead, blue and infinite. And somewhere in that vastness, 3 hostages were reunited with their families because a team of operators had trusted a pilot who'd been underestimated her entire career. The story spread through the special operations community the way these stories always did, whispered in team rooms, shared during training rotations, referenced in tactical briefs. The pilot who'd flown through an S-400 engagement zone to save a SEAL team. The A-10 driver who'd brought a shot-up aircraft home on one engine. The woman who'd proved that courage and competence had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with character. Reaper went back to her squadron, back to the routine of training flights and readiness exercises. But something had changed. The other pilots looked at her differently now. The maintenance crews treated her with a respect that went beyond professional courtesy. The squadron commander, a crusty fighter pilot who'd flown F-16s in Desert Storm, called her into his office and told her that her mission video was being used at the weapons school as an example of how to employ the A-10 in contested airspace. 6 months later, she was promoted to full commander and given command of her own attack squadron. On her first day, she assembled the pilots in the briefing room and placed the SEAL team patch on the podium in front of her. "This patch," she said, "belonged to a man who understood that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about being afraid and doing the job anyway. It was given to me by a team of operators who could have dismissed me, who had every institutional reason to distrust me, but who gave me the chance to prove myself. I'm putting this here as a reminder to all of us that we don't fly for recognition or medals or promotion boards. We fly for the people on the ground who depend on us. We fly for the operators who need us overhead when everything goes to hell. We fly because when we do our jobs right, Americans come home alive." The squadron erupted in applause, and in that moment, Reaper knew she'd found her place. Not because she'd finally been accepted, but because she'd stopped needing acceptance and started demanding respect through performance. The missions continued. Reaper led her squadron through a deployment to Afghanistan, where they provided close air support for special forces teams operating in the mountain provinces. She flew through dust storms and mechanical failures and enemy fire, always bringing her aircraft and her pilots home. She mentored young pilots, both male and female, teaching them that the sky didn't care about politics or prejudice, only about skill and determination. She wrote after-action reports that changed tactical doctrine. She spoke at war colleges about the evolution of close air support in contested environments. Years passed. Reaper's reputation grew from squadron legend to service-wide recognition. She was promoted to captain, then to rear admiral, becoming one of the first female combat pilots to reach flag rank. She never forgot the SEAL team patch, which hung in her office beside her medals and commendations. She never forgot Captain Holt, who'd given her the chance to prove herself. And she never forgot that moment when she'd put him on the floor and he'd laughed, recognizing in her not a threat to his authority, but a reflection of the values he'd spent his life defending. She retired after 30 years of service, her career spanning from the early days when she'd been a curiosity to the later years when female combat pilots were simply pilots. On her last day in uniform, she returned to Naval Special Warfare Command and asked to see Holt. He was older now, gray at the temples, with lines around his eyes that came from years of combat and command. He was a captain now himself, commanding his own special warfare unit, still running missions that would never make the news. They met in the same briefing room where their story had started. Holt looked at the Admiral's stars on her shoulders and shook his head in wonder. Admiral Vance. Who would have thought that the pilot who put me on my ass 20 years ago would end up outranking me? Reaper laughed. "I learned from the best, Marcus. You taught me that respect has to be earned, not given. That lesson shaped everything that came after." Pulled something from his pocket, the SEAL team patch she'd given back years ago when she'd made Admiral. "I want you to keep this, for real this time. Pass it on to someone who needs to hear the story. Someone who's being told they don't belong, that they can't hack it, that they're not good enough. Tell them about the pilot who flew through hell and brought everyone home. Tell them that the only limitations that matter are the ones we accept." She took the patch, feeling its familiar weight. I'll find someone worthy. Promise. They shook hands, two warriors who'd proven themselves in different arenas but shared the same code. As Reaper walked out of Naval Special Warfare Command for the last time, she looked up at the sky. The same sky she'd defended for 3 decades. The same sky that had witnessed her transformation from underestimated pilot to respected leader. The sun was setting, painting the clouds in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere out there, another young pilot was fighting for the chance to prove herself. Another woman was being told she didn't belong, that she couldn't measure up, that combat aviation was a man's world. Reaper smiled, thinking about the patch in her pocket and the story it carried. She'd find that pilot. She'd tell the story. And the cycle would continue, not because the fight was over, but because the fight was worth having. Because every time someone underestimated a woman in uniform, every time someone doubted whether she could deliver when it mattered, it created an opportunity for that woman to prove not just that she belonged, but that she excelled. The story of Reaper became legend in military aviation circles. It was told in flight schools and war colleges, whispered in squadron-ready rooms and special operations team houses. The details might have changed with each telling. Some versions had her taking out 10 enemy positions instead of 5. Others had her flying home with both engines destroyed. But the core truth remained constant. A pilot who'd been underestimated had proven herself under fire. A woman who'd been dismissed had saved American lives. An operator who'd been tested had passed with distinction. Years after Reaper's retirement, a young A-10 pilot named Lieutenant Kiera Blade Morrison sat in a briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Command. She'd been called in to provide air support for a SEAL team extraction mission, and the men around the table were looking at her with expressions she recognized immediately. Captain Jonathan "Ghost" Reynolds, the team leader, studied her personnel file with obvious skepticism. His next words were almost identical to the ones Holt had spoken 2 decades earlier. "Lieutenant Morrison, A-10 pilot, 3 years in service. No combat deployments yet, and now they're sending you to support my team in hostile territory. You understand this isn't a training exercise, right? This is live fire, real bullets, and if you screw up, my men die." Morrison felt the familiar anger rising. The same anger every female pilot felt when her competence was questioned before she'd even had the chance to demonstrate it. But she remembered the stories about Reaper, the legend who'd walked this same path and emerged victorious. She reached into her flight suit pocket and pulled out something that made Reynolds freeze. The SEAL team patch that had been passed from Holt to Reaper to 3 other female pilots before reaching her. "Sir," Morrison said quietly, "do you know what this patch represents? It represents a pilot who was tested exactly the way you're testing me right now. It represents a woman who proved that courage and competence have nothing to do with gender. And it represents a promise that I made to the admiral who gave me this patch, that I would carry forward the legacy she started. So you can question my credentials, you can doubt my capabilities, you can test me however you want. But at the end of the day, I'm going to bring your team home alive just like Reaper did. That's not a hope, that's not a goal, that's a guarantee." The room went silent. Reynolds stared at the patch, recognition slowly dawning in his expression. That patch belonged to Admiral Vance. I know that patch. I studied her mission in tactics school. You're telling me she gave this to you?" Morrison nodded. "She gave it to me with a message. She said the only limitations that matter are the ones we accept. She said when people underestimate you, you don't argue, you prove them wrong through performance. And she said that every time I fly, I'm not just representing myself. I'm representing every woman who came before me and every woman who will come after. So yes, sir, this is that patch, and I'm going to honor it." Reynolds studied her for a long moment, then did something that surprised everyone in the room. He stood and extended his hand. "Lieutenant Morrison, forgive my skepticism. It's not about you specifically, it's about the stakes. But if Reaper trusted you with that patch, then you've already passed the most important test. Welcome to the team. Let's bring our people home." 24 hours later, Morrison was flying through hostile airspace, providing close air support for Reynolds' team during a high-risk extraction mission. Enemy fire lit up the night sky. Her radar warning receiver screamed warnings about surface-to-air threats. The mission went sideways exactly the way these missions always did: complications, unexpected resistance, and a moment when everything hung in the balance, and the only thing standing between success and catastrophe was a pilot's skill and determination. Morrison stayed on station past her fuel reserves, made gun runs through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, and talked Reynolds' team through a running firefight that lasted 40 minutes. When the SEALs finally made it to the extraction point, when the helicopters lifted off with all personnel accounted for, Reynolds called her on the radio. "Blade, that was the finest display of close air support I've witnessed in 15 years of combat operations. You didn't just meet the standard that Reaper set. You exceeded it. You're an operator in my book, and that's the highest compliment I can give." Morrison brought her A-10 home through the dawn sky, her aircraft damaged but flying, her fuel gauge reading vapor but still enough to make the runway. As she climbed down from the cockpit, she pulled out the SEAL team patch and looked at it. This piece of fabric that carried the weight of 2 decades of female pilots proving themselves in a field that had once seemed impossible to break into. She thought about Reaper, about the moment when Holt had handed her this same patch and told her she'd earned it. She thought about all the women who'd worn this patch and carried its legacy forward. And she thought about the young pilots who were still in flight school, still fighting for the chance to prove themselves, still being told they didn't belong. The fight wasn't over. It might never be over. But every mission mattered. Every success created space for the next woman. Every time someone like Morrison delivered under pressure, it became harder to argue that women couldn't do the job. The sun rose over the base, painting the sky in those same shades of orange and gold that Reaper had seen decades earlier. Morrison held the patch up to the light, watching the colors play across its faded fabric. Somewhere, a young girl was looking up at that same sky and dreaming of flying. Somewhere, a cadet was being told she'd never make it through flight school. Somewhere, a lieutenant was sitting in a briefing room full of men who doubted her capabilities. The patch would find them. The story would reach them. And the legacy that started with a pilot called Reaper, a woman who'd been told to punch her in the jaw and had responded by showing them what a real operator could do, would continue. Not because the fight was easy, but because it was necessary. Not because respect was given, but because it was earned. Not because anyone believed women belonged in combat aviation, but because women like Reaper and Morrison kept proving it was true, one mission at a time, one aircraft at a time, one life saved at a time. The sky belonged to those brave enough to claim it. And the legend of the Reaper ensured that women would keep claiming that sky, generation after generation, until the day when gender became irrelevant and the only questions that mattered were, can you fly? Can you fight? Can you bring your people home? Admiral Alexis Reaper Vance sat in her retirement home office, mountains visible through the window, and wrote the last entry in her personal journal. "I spent 30 years proving I belonged in a cockpit. I spent 3 decades answering doubts with performance, skepticism with results, and prejudice with professionalism. I've been tested, shot at, dismissed, underestimated, and challenged at every step of my career. And I'd do it all again without hesitation, because the fight was never about me. It was about the pilots who came after me. It was about creating a path where there had been only obstacles. It was about proving that courage wears many faces, speaks in many voices, and knows no gender. To the young pilots reading this someday, you will face people who doubt you. You will encounter those who question your capabilities before you've had the chance to demonstrate them. You will be tested harder and judged more critically than your male counterparts. This is unfair. This is wrong. This is reality." She paused, choosing her words carefully, knowing they might reach pilots not yet born. "But here's what I learned. Every doubt is an opportunity. Every test is a chance to prove yourself. Every moment when someone underestimates you is a moment when you can exceed their expectations so thoroughly that they'll never make that mistake again. Don't fight for acceptance. Demand respect through performance. Don't argue that you belong, prove it beyond any doubt. And when you succeed, when you bring your team home and complete the mission and demonstrate your capabilities, don't celebrate too loudly. Just get ready for the next mission because the work is never finished. The sky is infinite and there's always another flight, another challenge, another chance to prove what you already know, that you're exactly where you belong. She signed the journal entry with her call sign, Reaper, and closed the book. Outside, an A-10 Thunderbolt II flew past, its silhouette unmistakable against the afternoon sky. The pilot was female. Reaper could see that much even from a distance. She watched the aircraft bank and disappear over the mountains, carrying forward a legacy that had been paid for in years of sacrifice, determination, and unwavering commitment to excellence. The story that had started with "punch her in the jaw" had evolved into something larger than any single person or mission. It had become a testament to the power of competence over prejudice, of performance over perception, of character over convenience. Captain Marcus Holt, now retired himself, called her that evening. They talked rarely but remained connected by the bond forged in combat decades earlier. "Did you see the promotion list?" he asked without preamble. "Morrison made Major. She's being assigned as Operations Officer for the 74th Fighter Squadron. They're giving her a whole squadron of A-10s to play with." Reaper smiled. "Blade earned it. That mission she flew in Syria last year was textbook. Hell, it was better than textbook. She improvised an engagement sequence I'd never seen before and saved a Ranger platoon that had no business surviving that ambush." "She told me you've been mentoring her," Holt said. "Called you her guardian angel." "I just answered her questions," Reaper replied. "Same way you answered mine 2 decades ago. The work does itself if you give people the chance to prove themselves." There was a pause on the line, the comfortable silence of old warriors who'd seen enough combat to know when words weren't necessary. Then Holt spoke again, his voice carrying weight. "Alex, I want to apologize for that first briefing, for testing you the way I did, for doubting you before you'd even had the chance to show what you could do." Reaper considered her response carefully. "Marcus, if you hadn't tested me, I never would have had the chance to prove myself. If you just accepted me on paper credentials, I'd have always wondered if I really measured up. You gave me the hardest test you could, and when I passed, there was no doubt left. Not for you, not for your team, and not for me. I don't need an apology. I need you to keep doing what you did. Test people. Challenge them. Push them to their limits. Just make sure you're testing their capabilities, not your assumptions." He laughed, that same genuine sound from 2 decades past. "You always were smarter than me. Stubborn as hell, but smarter." "Had to be," she said. "I was fighting uphill the whole way. Makes you learn efficiency." They talked for another hour, sharing updates about former team members, comparing notes on tactical evolution, and discussing the future of close air support in an era of contested airspace and advanced threats. When they finally hung up, Reaper sat in the gathering darkness and thought about the arc of her career. She'd started as a lieutenant who had to fight for every opportunity, who'd been dismissed and doubted and tested beyond any reasonable measure. She'd ended as an admiral, a tactical innovator, and a mentor to the next generation of combat pilots. The journey between those points had been marked by missions like the SEAL extraction, moments when everything hung in the balance and the only thing that mattered was whether you could deliver under pressure. She delivered, every single time. Not perfectly, no pilot flew perfect missions, but consistently enough that the doubts faded, the skepticism dissolved, and the respect became automatic rather than grudging. The SEAL team patch hung on her wall, illuminated by a single spotlight. Next to it was her silver star, her distinguished flying cross, and her various campaign medals. But the patch mattered more than any of the official decorations because it represented something deeper than valor or skill. It represented acceptance into a brotherhood that didn't give membership lightly. It represented recognition from warriors who understood the cost of combat and the value of someone who had your back when bullets started flying. It represented a bridge between services, between genders, between the old guard and the new generation. Lieutenant Morrison called a week later, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "Admiral, I have news. They're assigning me to develop the new close air support doctrine for contested airspace. They want me to write the manual based on your missions and my recent operations. I'm going to need your help. There's nobody who understands high-threat CAS better than you." Reaper felt a surge of satisfaction. This was how change happened, not through speeches or policy directives, but through competent operators rising through the ranks and reshaping the institution from within. "Kiera, I'd be honored to help. But understand something. That manual needs to be written so well that nobody can question it. Every tactical decision needs justification. Every technique needs to be validated through multiple missions. The work has to be so good that the old guard can't dismiss it as political correctness or lowered standards. It has to be perfect." "I know," Morrison said. "That's why I need your help. I can fly the missions, but you've got the big picture understanding of how this fits into joint operations. Plus, you've got the credibility. When you speak, people listen." They spent the next 6 months collaborating on the doctrine manual. Reaper traveled to Morrison's base, flew observer missions in the back seat of a two-seat trainer, and participated in war games that tested the new tactics against advanced threats. The manual they produced was comprehensive, technically rigorous, and grounded in combat experience. When it was published, it immediately became required reading at every flight school and weapons school in the Air Force and Navy. The doctrine spread. Other pilots adopted the techniques. Mission success rates improved. And gradually, imperceptibly, the culture began to shift. Female combat pilots were still a minority, but they were no longer a curiosity. They were operators, judged by their performance rather than their gender. The questions changed from "Can women do this?" to "How can we do this better?" Captain Reynolds, Ghost, wrote the foreword to the manual. His words carried weight throughout the special operations community. "I have been supported by hundreds of pilots during my 20 years in special operations. The best among them share certain characteristics: technical proficiency, tactical flexibility, courage under fire, and an absolute commitment to bringing the team home. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and Admiral Vance embody all of these characteristics. The tactics outlined in this manual have been proven in combat by operators who flew through hell to keep my teams alive. Study these techniques, master them, and understand that the sky doesn't care about your gender, your background, or your politics. The sky only cares whether you can fly." Years continued to pass. Reaper entered her 70s, her hair silver, her movements slower but her mind still sharp. She watched from retirement as the women she'd mentored rose through the ranks, commanded squadrons, shaped policy, and trained the next generation. The patch that had started with Holt found its way to a dozen different pilots. Each one added to its legend flying missions that would have seemed impossible decades earlier. The A-10 Thunderbolt II itself became a symbol. This ugly, ungainly aircraft that wasn't supposed to survive modern warfare but kept proving its critics wrong through sheer effectiveness. Like the women who flew it, the Warthog succeeded not through elegance but through competence, not through acceptance but through results. On Reaper's 80th birthday, she received a package from an address she didn't recognize. Inside was a photograph, a young woman in flight gear standing in front of an A-10, her helmet under her arm, her expression confident and determined. The note attached read, "Admiral Vance, my name is Second Lieutenant Maria Chen. I'm the newest A-10 pilot in the 74th Fighter Squadron. Yesterday, I received the SEAL Team patch from Lieutenant Colonel Morrison. She told me your story, about the briefing where they tested you, about the mission where you proved yourself, about the career you built by demanding respect through performance. She told me that when I face doubts and challenges, I should remember that I'm part of a legacy that was paid for by pilots like you who refuse to accept limitations. I want you to know that I'm going to honor that legacy. I'm going to fly every mission like Americans' lives depend on it because they do. I'm going to be so good that nobody can question whether I belong. And someday, when I'm ready to pass this patch forward, I'm going to tell the next pilot about you, about Reaper, who showed us all what real courage looks like. Thank you for the path you cleared. I promise not to waste it." Reaper held the photograph with hands that trembled slightly from age. She studied the young pilot's face, seeing in it the same determination she'd felt at that age, the same fire that had carried her through 3 decades of combat and command. The cycle continued. The legacy grew. And somewhere in the sky above, an A-10 Thunderbolt II was flying a mission, piloted by a woman who'd been told she didn't belong but who had proven otherwise through skill, courage, and unwavering commitment to excellence. The story that started with "punch her in the jaw" had transformed into something larger than any single mission or career. It had become a testament to the fundamental truth that competence transcends all artificial boundaries, that courage knows no gender, and that the only limitations that matter are the ones we accept. Admiral Alexis Reaper Vance wrote back to Second Lieutenant Chen. The letter was brief but carried the weight of 3 decades of experience. "Lieutenant, you don't need my permission to be great. You don't need my blessing to prove yourself. The sky belongs to those brave enough to claim it, and you've already shown that courage by strapping yourself into that cockpit. Fly well, fight hard, bring everyone home. That's not just advice, it's the only mission that matters. The rest is noise. When you face doubt, don't argue. Just fly the mission better than anyone thought possible and let your performance do the talking. And when you eventually pass that patch forward, tell them it wasn't easy. Tell them it required sacrifice and determination and countless moments when you had to prove yourself all over again. But also tell them it was worth it. Every challenge, every test, every moment of doubt. Because on the other side of all that struggle is the knowledge that you earned your place through merit, that you belong in that cockpit because you proved it beyond any doubt, and that the sky is yours for as long as you have the courage to keep claiming it. Welcome to the legacy, Lieutenant. Fly like the Reaper is watching, because I am, and I expect great things, clear skies and straight shooting." She signed it with her call sign and mailed it the next morning. 3 months later, Lieutenant Chen flew her first combat mission, close air support for a Marine unit pinned down by enemy fire in a contested valley. The mission went exactly the way these missions always went. Equipment malfunctioned. Communications were degraded. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. And in the middle of that chaos, a young pilot who'd been underestimated her entire career made decision after decision that kept Americans alive. She stayed on station past her fuel reserves. She made gun runs through concentrated fire. She talked the Marines through an extraction under pressure that would have broken lesser pilots. When she finally brought her damaged A-10 home, when she climbed down from the cockpit with her hands shaking from adrenaline and her flight suit soaked with sweat, the Marine captain she'd supported was waiting on the flight line. He saluted, a formal, respectful gesture that transcended rank and service branch. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, his voice carrying across the tarmac, "my Marines are alive because of you. You're the kind of pilot legends are made of. Thank you doesn't begin to cover it, but thank you." Chen looked at this combat-hardened officer who just watched her keep his unit alive through the longest 4 hours of their lives. She thought about Reaper, about Morrison, about all the women who'd flown similar missions and proven themselves in similar ways. "Sir," she said quietly, "I was just doing my job. Same job pilots have been doing since aircraft first carried weapons. The only difference is that some people still seem surprised when a woman does it well. I'm working on fixing that surprise." The Marine captain smiled. "After today, Lieutenant, nobody who saw you fly will ever be surprised again. You didn't just do your job well. You did it better than anyone I've seen in 15 years of combat operations. That's not about gender, that's about excellence." The story spread. Another mission. Another woman proving herself. Another data point in the growing body of evidence that competence was genderless, that courage wore many faces, and that the sky belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. Admiral Reaper Vance heard about the mission through the informal network of retired pilots who stayed connected to the combat community. She read the after-action reports, studied the mission video, and analyzed Chen's tactical decisions with the critical eye of someone who'd flown similar missions hundreds of times. The kid was good. Raw, still learning, making some mistakes that experience would polish away, but fundamentally, undeniably good. The kind of pilot who would shape the next generation. The cycle was complete. The legacy was secure. The path that Reaper had fought to clear was now wide enough for others to follow, and each pilot who followed made it wider still for those who came after. On a clear spring morning, Reaper drove to the base where she'd last served on active duty. The guard at the gate recognized her immediately. Impossible not to recognize the face that appeared in every leadership presentation about breaking barriers and demanding excellence. "Admiral Vance," the young airman said, saluting sharply. "Welcome back, ma'am. It's an honor to see you." She returned the salute and drove onto the base, heading toward the flight line where A-10s were lined up in neat rows. The aircraft looked the same as they had decades earlier, still ugly, still powerful, still the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. A flight of 4 Warthogs was preparing for departure. She watched from a safe distance as the pilots conducted their pre-flight inspections, strapped into their cockpits and started their engines. The familiar sound of TF-34 turbines spooling up brought back a flood of memories: missions flown, risks taken, lives saved. 3 of the 4 pilots were women. Reaper felt something catch in her throat. 3 decades ago, she'd been the only woman in her squadron. Now female pilots were common enough that a 4-ship flight could be majority women without anyone commenting on it. Progress wasn't always visible day to day, but over years and decades, it became undeniable. The flight took off in sequence, each A-10 rotating and climbing into the morning sky. Reaper watched until they were specks on the horizon, heading toward a training range where they'd practice the same tactics she'd helped develop, refined by pilots like Morrison, and now being passed to the next generation like Chen. She pulled the SEAL team patch from her pocket, not the one that was traveling from pilot to pilot, but the original one that Holt had given her decades earlier. She'd kept it separate, a personal reminder of the mission that had changed everything. The fabric was faded now, the colors muted by time, but the meaning remained sharp. "Captain Holt," she said quietly to the empty air, "we did it. We opened the door. We proved it could be done. The rest is up to them, and they're doing a hell of a job." As if in answer, her phone rang. It was Morrison. "Admiral, I'm at the Pentagon. They just asked me to brief the Joint Chiefs on the new close air support doctrine. They want to implement it service-wide and make it the standard for all contested airspace operations. Your tactics are about to become official U.S. military doctrine." Reaper closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 decades of combat, struggle, and determination settle into something that felt like completion. Not victory. The fight for equality was ongoing and would continue long after she was gone. But completion, proof that the work mattered, evidence that the path she'd cleared was leading somewhere worth going. "Kira," she said, "make sure you give credit where it's due. This doctrine came from combat experience, from pilots who flew the missions and learned the lessons. It came from SEALs who trusted us overhead. It came from the institutional willingness to evolve beyond prejudice and judge operators by their performance. This is bigger than any individual." "I know," Morrison replied. "But individuals matter too. The Joint Chiefs need to understand that this doctrine exists because pilots like you refused to accept limitations, because you demanded respect through performance, and because you proved that courage and competence have no gender. Your name is going in the official history. Your missions are going to be studied for generations. You're going to be remembered, Admiral, not as a female pilot, but as one of the finest combat aviators in U.S. military history." Reaper looked up at the sky, watching contrails from the training flight arc across the blue expanse. "Then make sure they remember the mission, Kira. Make sure they remember that it was never about me breaking barriers. It was about Americans coming home alive. Everything else is just context." She hung up and stood on the flight line for another hour, watching aircraft take off and land, feeling the sun on her face and the wind that always seemed to blow across military airfields. This was where she belonged. Not in the cockpit anymore. Her flying days were long past. But here, in this space between earth and sky, where courage was tested and legends were born, and the only thing that mattered was whether you could deliver when lives depended on it. The story of Reaper would be told for generations. It would be taught in classrooms and briefing rooms, studied by tactical analysts and leadership instructors. The specific details might blur with time: the exact number of missions flown, the precise weapons employed, the names of everyone involved. But the core truth would remain. A pilot who'd been underestimated had proven herself under fire. A woman who'd been tested had passed with distinction. An operator who'd been told she didn't belong had shown everyone exactly where she belonged, in the sky, over the battlefield, keeping Americans alive. And because she'd flown those missions, because she'd proven it could be done, the pilots who came after her faced less resistance, fewer doubts, and more opportunities to demonstrate their own excellence. The path was clearer because Reaper had cleared it. The door was wider because she'd pushed it open. The legacy was secure because she'd paid the price to establish it. Admiral Alexis, Reaper, Vance returned to her car and drove home through the afternoon sunlight. Behind her, on the flight line, another generation of pilots was learning to fly. Some of them were women who would face their own challenges, their own moments of doubt, their own tests of courage and competence. They would succeed because Reaper and pilots like her had proven it was possible. They would excel because the path had been cleared. And they would continue the legacy because the work was never finished, the mission was never complete, and the sky belonged to anyone brave enough to claim it. The end of one story was always the beginning of another. The pilot who'd been told to punch her in the jaw had shown them what a real Navy SEAL could do, not by conforming to their expectations, but by exceeding them so thoroughly that the expectations themselves had to change. She'd flown through hell and brought everyone home. She'd proven that courage transcended gender and competence demolished prejudice. She'd opened doors and cleared paths and paid prices so that the pilots who followed would have it easier. Not easy. The work of combat aviation was never easy, but easier, more possible, more acceptable. The sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in those eternal shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in that vast expanse, pilots were flying missions, making decisions, keeping Americans safe. Some of those pilots were women who carried forward the legacy that Reaper had established through 3 decades of excellence. The story continued. The legacy grew. And the sky remained infinite, waiting for the next generation of pilots brave enough to claim it. The fight that started with mockery and ended with respect had transformed into something larger, a testament to the fundamental truth that limitations are chosen, not given, and that the only real barrier to excellence is the willingness to accept someone else's definition of what's possible. Reaper had refused that definition. She'd written her own. And in doing so, she'd given every pilot who followed the permission to do the same.